So before I get too carried away getting this fully mounted in place, I gotta start by cutting off these 3 tabs. There's 2 on that side, 1 on this side. I believe that's for the AC condenser when it's in a second gen, which isn't being used in this truck because the condenser is going to be inside of it, but these definitely get in the way of the grill. And then I'm going to see if there's enough room for these to fit behind the grill either. I don't want to get too far ahead and find out that this is like a lost cause and we need to ditch the AC. So I'm going to get those cut off. All right, so I got those tabs cut off and ground down. This side's not a problem. That side over there is not a problem, but I do think I'm gonna have to relocate these brackets because that is definitely where it hits first, especially on that side. It's hitting right there. This side isn't bad. It'll suck in, and we'll be able to just trim that part of the grill out a little bit to gain a little bit more clearance. We were trying to keep everything as factory as possible, so if we needed to upgrade to a different intercooler in the future, it was kind of a drop-in, but looking like that's not going to be the case. So I'm going to cut off the factory mounts, and that'll help get this grill be able to suck in, and then I think that we'll be able to live with that afterwards. So at this point, I started making the bottom mounts for the intercooler. I did already make the driver's side before I made the footage here, so I had a general idea of what I needed to get done. So I started off by cutting some 1.5" angle iron, followed up by some 1.5" square tubing, and that's what ultimately is going to be holding the bottom of the intercooler in place, and that way I can figure out where I need to relocate those tabs and how much stuff I need to cut out to get everything to fit properly. So I got the pieces that I cut out on the bandsaw over here in the vise, just cleaning up all the edges, debar, and everything quick. Getting the intercooler set up in place and transferring holes into the square tubing. Then ultimately I'm using some nut certs, and then the little trick that I did is I used a countersink bit to recess the end of the nut cert flushed with the top of the tube, and that way the bracket would be able to sit flush on the tube and not get stuck on the end of the nut cert. And then I just cut some angle iron down, and that's what I ended up using for the end cap of the square tube. So brought everything over to the TIG welding bench, got everything cleaned up with some acetone. Got the end caps tacked up in place. I did put an extra tack on the nut cert just so I didn't have to worry about anything coming loose in the future. That was the one downside of countersinking them, is that the material got a little thin, but there's not a huge amount of pressure on them. So we got the end caps welded up in place, and then the last thing I did was put some bolts in those threaded holes, and that was just so I cool it off on water, just to try to minimize the amount of water that got inside the tube, so I wouldn't have to worry about rust or anything like that in the future. So you can start to get an idea of how this mount is going to work. The factory second gen bottom intercooler mount bolts to the square tube. The square tube acts as a spacer to go between the radius support and that mount. A piece of angle iron gets welded to that mount, sits on top of the structure on the radius support, and that ultimately gets bolted in place. So I'm just lining everything up, making some marks so I can get everything welded up into place, and then it's just back and forth with test fits and getting the next piece of the puzzle put together. Got that first angle iron piece on the side welded on place, got the nut cert put into the radius support. Everything test fit pretty good, so at this point locking that down into position so I can mark out the location for the second piece of angle iron. So pulling the intercooler back out of place, removing both of the mounts, cut out a little bit of the condenser bracket just to make sure that the next piece of angle iron would sit flat. Transfer that, and that's going to get welded up, transfer holes, nut cert, etc. So just getting that second angle iron piece welded up in place, using the piece of aluminum here just to make sure that both brackets are on the same plane, because it is a flat surface, and that'll help pull everything nice and tight. So everything's clamped up in place until it gets tack welded together, and then just went and fully welded out both brackets, went double checked over the rest of everything, and rounded off all the corners. So with that bracket all welded up, was able to bring it back over to the truck, get it bolted in place with the one bolt that I had, and then transfer the hole for the next second nut cert. I did use the same trick as I did on the back side of the angle iron, so that the head of the nut cert that's in the radius support would sit flush, and the bracket would actually sit flush against the radius support itself. So transfer the hole, draw out the hole, use the nut cert tool. I did also add another mounting hole for the condenser, because one of them got lost when cutting out the main hole that the actual intercooler sits through, so that way that would be nice and tight as well. All right, so it's been a couple hours. I got both lower mounts made. I actually made this side first off camera, came up with the design that I liked, and then I copied it over there, showed you guys how I did it. So the intercooler is ready to go in with the lower mounts. As far as I was able to use all the mounts that came with, for a second gen, I had to cut the one top tab off. But other than that, everything fits up pretty good. It feels pretty solid. And then I just have to figure out what we're doing with the top mounts there. Probably just going to cut those mounts off, reuse them, weld them back onto the tanks. And that's one step closer to getting this intercooler all buttoned up into the truck, nice and solid, and then we can start piping. So it's in for the first time by itself without the jack supporting it. I still need to do the top supports, and I did just reconfirm again that I am going to have to cut those mounts off and then move them closer inboard. One, that will allow the grill to sit flush and sit closer to it, and two, right now they're like right in the grill vent and they're like right in your face. So move them back a little bit, it'll kind of hide them just that little bit more. So we're gonna get those cut off, get everything cleaned up, tacked in place, and then start seeing how the rest of those mounts are gonna work out. Just using the Sawzall here, cutting off all the tabs, a little WD-40 for some lubrication, and then just sanding everything down, getting all the paint off, and getting a surface nice cleaned up, ready for the weld. So with those tabs all cleaned up, I just use a scrap piece of steel here for a spacer to space it up off the front, and then just measured, I think it was 4.5 inches from the top of the intercooler down to the edge of the bracket, and then just made the bracket square with the end tank of the intercooler. Definitely had some struggles here getting everything welded up, but is what it is, and ground down the front of it and made it all nice. All right, so the mounts are cut off and re-welded in. I just I cut them off, and then I measured 4 inches down from the top with a spacer underneath, and that's just kind of how I called it. They look good. I made them perpendicular to the angle, so they are at an angle a little bit. Not sure if that bothers me or not. I kind of had a hell of a time getting those things welded on there because the tank is a lot thicker than the tab itself. Kind of inexperienced when it comes to aluminum. That's the benefit of this project, is that it's given me some good experience. So I just ground everything down to make it look nice for the stuff that you're going to see. But other than that, not too worried about it. So now we're just going to make the spacers that go in between these mounts. It'll just be a block that gets bolted in from either side. So what I did over here is this is what I'm going to use. So it's 2 3/4 from the radius support to the back of the rubber. Each end is going to have a washer on the end of it to kind of space out and give some surface area. So I marked the line, marked another line with those washers, and that's going to be the dimension of the tube that I'm going to cut. Got the square tube cut down to size, all the edges cleaned up, stuff like that. Got the zinc coating ground off the washers that I'm going to be using as a spacer. So I got 2 washers that I'm pressing into the end of the square tube, and that's where the nutsert is going to be held in place by, and then the one bigger washer that's going to be welded on the outside. So got the washers inside welded up. One end got drilled out to accept a larger nutsert. One side I used an M8 and the factory bolt was M6. So there's 2 different sizes there. Got both washers welded up on the end, everything cooled down, cleaned up, and that's one side done. So with both brackets all welded up, I got the nutserts set in and crimped down into both pieces. From there, I brought them over to the truck. I used that as a guide to mark the radiator support. Got the hole in the radiator support drilled through, and then it gets through bolted from the back side, and then the intercooler gets bolted up through the front side. And then from here on, this is going to be really the last time for a while that the intercooler is going to be out. Once the project is wrapping up, I'll get it pulled out once again, paint the brackets, do final touch up and stuff like that. But this is it, it's in place. So intercooler's in, the mounts came out halfway decent. They're not perfect, but it gets the job done. Intercooler is in the truck. It's bolted down solid. It's not going to go anywhere. So this is going to wrap up this step. Still waiting on the piping and stuff coming in. I got some pieces in, but waiting on the rest of it so we can finish up doing that. Still need the turbo housing to come in as well for the other side, but one step closer. Overall, pretty pleased on how this is. Now I can fab up everything because I know where it's going to be, and then it'll just have to come out one last time to put some, there we go, some trim around the opening there and paint up the brackets and final hardware check with Loctite and lock washers and all that stuff. So stay tuned to the channel. Make sure you subscribe and comment down below if you're liking what we're doing here, and then be on the lookout for the upcoming content on more of Zach's short bed build. Thanks for watching.